Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are on ayah 233 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Let us continue بحول الله وقوته. قال الله تعالى: والوالدات يرضعن أولادهن حولين كاملين لمن أراد أن يتم الرضاعة وعلى المولود له رزقهن وكسوتهن بالمعروف لا تكلف نفس إلا وسعها لا تضار والدة بولدها ولا مولود بولده وعلى الوارث مثل ذلك فإن أرادا فصالا عن تراض منهما وتشاور فلا جناح عليهما وإن أردتم أن تسترضعوا أولادكم فلا جناح عليكم إذا سلمتم ما آتيتم بالمعروف واتقوا الله واعلموا أن الله بما تعملون بصير. The previous ayat was speaking about talaq. This ayah speaks about a related matter to marriage, which is the breastfeeding of the child. So these ayat that we are discussing are all fiqhi ayat, matters of jurisprudence, which tells you that Surah Al-Baqarah has to be a Madaniyah surah. There's simply no point in talking about fiqhi matters to the mushrikeen who do not even accept the oneness of Allah in worship. He says, وَالْوَالِدَاتِ, that means mothers. It's the plural of walida, mother. يُرْضِعْنَ, from arba'a, يُرْضِعُ, to breastfeed. أَوْلَادَهُنَّ, their children. حَوْلَيْنِ, حَوْلَيْن is the double form of hawl, and a hawl is a lunar year. So we're not talking January to December. We are talking from Muharram to Dhul Hijjah. So these are 2 whole lunar years for those parents who want to yutimma, complete ar-rada'a, the term of suckling. Now you would notice that this is a declarative statement. However, we have said that a declarative statement can still indicate obligation, and that a declarative statement is more emphatic than an order format. As for when he says al-mawlud lahu, literally means the one for whom the child is born, so this is referring to the father. So upon him is the rizq, that is the food, and the kiswa, that is the clothing for the mother, bil ma'ruf, on a reasonable basis, meaning in accordance with his means. The richer he is, the more he can spend, and so on. La tukallafu nafsun illa wus'aha. Taklif meaning burdened or commissioned. Nafsun, any soul. Wus'a means your capacity or ability. So no person is burdened with more than they can bear. La tudarra walidatun biwaladiha. The mother should not be harmed on account of her child. This is to say, the father should not take away the child to annoy the mother. And this is the case if they are divorced. وَلَا مَوْلُودٌ لَهُ بِوَلَدِهِ. Nor the father should be harmed on account of his child, which means to say that the mother, in this case the divorced wife, so the former wife, should not refuse to suckle the child, because that would harm the father. Remember, it is the father's responsibility to have the child breastfed. This could be from the biological mother or by a wet nurse. Either way, it's the father's responsibility. Why? Because the child belongs to the father. He takes his name after the father, not after the mother. وَعَلَى الْوَارِثِ مِثْلُ ذَلِكَ. Upon the inheritor is a duty similar to it. The meaning of this section, according to the majority of scholars, is the warith, the inheritor of the father, has a similar responsibility in terms of paying the breastfeeding mother, her food and her clothes and her general upkeep, and also in terms of not harming the mother by taking the child away from her. In fact, the Hanabila and the Hanafiya take this section to say that the near relatives must spend on each other if they are rich enough to do so, and their relatives are poor and are unable to work. And this comes under the heading of nafaqah, expenditure. Then he goes on to say, فَإِنْ أَرَادَ, if they both want, meaning the husband and the former wife, فِصَالًا, that is to say, stop the breastfeeding before their 2 years elapse. عَنْ تَرَاضٍ, on mutual consent, so they both must consent to this. وَتَشَاوُرْ, they have consulted with each other, so nobody is acting like a tyrant. فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْهِمَا, then there is no sin or no problem on them if they do this. He then says, if you want, أَن تَسْتَرْضِعُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ, that is to say, give your children to a wet nurse to breastfeed. فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ, there is no problem on you, meaning on you, O men. إِذَا سَلَّمْتُمْ, if you have given or handed over, مَا آتَيْتُمْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, what you give on reasonable basis, meaning as long as you pay the wet nurse on reasonable terms, then that is fine. You may hire a wet nurse. Now, why would this even be the case? It may be the case that the mother has been divorced and she has married another man. So she will be busy with him as the husband has the priority with the wife. And so the first husband, the father of the child, does not want to give the child to the mother and would rather somebody else breastfeed his child. Or it may even be the case that the divorced mother is charging her husband too much, so the husband goes for a cheaper option. You may have even noticed also the iltifat, which we have spoken about before. He's saying وَإِنْ أَرَدْتُمْ, if you want, whereas before he was speaking in the third person. That is to say, if they want the fisal. So what are some of the lessons we can pick up from this ayah? Well, number one, the obligation of mothers to breastfeed their children. Now, if they are not divorced, the obligation is fairly obvious. However, if the mothers are divorced, the obligation is not as obvious. Rather, the obligation is on the father to have a woman breastfeed his child. It's the father's child, not the mother's child. The mother is not obligated to breastfeed her child if she is divorced. So if the husband who has divorced the mother wants her to breastfeed the child, he has to pay her wages, as the ayah says. If the father can find another woman, that is to say, a wet nurse, what they call in Arabic a li'r, and it is the case that the child will actually accept the milk from another woman, and the father is able to pay the wet nurse, then the biological mother is not obliged to breastfeed the child, because the child's needs are being taken care of. However, if a wet nurse is unavailable or far too expensive to afford, then the obligation is on the mother, because if she does not breastfeed the child, then the child will suffer. We take that the breastfeeding period is 2 years, and that is 2 lunar years. Although the ayah says it is possible to stop the breastfeeding before that if both the parents agree to this and after mutual consultation. And so this tells us that the breastfeeding matter is a serious matter because the child's welfare is at stake. And we also take from this that the husband, even though he has authority in the marriage, is not allowed to act like a tyrant. Rather, he has to consult the wife in these important matters, such as the fisal, or when you're going to separate the baby from the breastfeeding, because fisal comes from fasala, which means to separate. So any husband who thinks that he has the authority in the marriage contract, so his word is always final, needs to curb his ego and read this particular ayah, which talks about tashawur, mutual consultation and mutual consent. Okay, here's a question. Can you breastfeed the child beyond 2 years? We say that we need to look at the condition of the child. If he is in need of milk, then there is no problem in prolonging the period. Otherwise, the breastfeeding period ends after 2 whole lunar years, and this is normally the case. We take from this ayah that the child belongs to the father and takes his name after the father, because the ayah says, وَعَلَى الْمَوْلُودِ لَهُ, on the one for whom the child is born, and this is referring to the father, not the mother. Note how the ayah says that the father's responsibility is to pay for the food and clothing of the breastfeeding woman. Now, if this breastfeeding woman is the wife, and let us now also suppose that the wife is guilty of nushuz, which is gross disobedience and recalcitrance against the husband, then we know that the husband is not obliged to spend on such a wife. However, if this wife, who is a nashiz, is breastfeeding his child, then on that count he has to pay her. Not because she's a wife, but because she is a breastfeeder of his child. We also learn that the husband spends on a reasonable basis, and this is in accordance with how much the husband has. As Allah Jalla wa Ala says in Surah At-Talaq, لِيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَعَةٍ مِّن سَعَتِهِ. The one who is rich, let him spend from his richness. So it depends on the state of the husband, not that of the wife. We take from this ayah the mercy of Allah, that He does not burden a person any more than he can bear, be it financially or physically. We learn from this ayah that both the husband and the wife, or former wife as the case may be, are not allowed to harm each other using the child, so that they use the child as a weapon against each other. This is entirely possible and also entirely haram. We learn from this ayah that the inheritor of the father has the duty to pay the wet nurse for the breastfeeding. This could be the case if the father is too poor to afford a wet nurse, or the father maybe has died and somebody still has to pay the wet nurse, or even the wife if she is divorced, because she takes the same place as the wet nurse. If the wife is not divorced, then according to the weightier opinion, she does not have the right to ask for payment for the breastfeeding because she's a wife. She's not a stranger. She has to breastfeed her own child. It is an obligation on her. So she cannot exactly say, pay me, otherwise I will not breastfeed the child. She can say this if she's divorced. A wet nurse can obviously say this because it's a service, but a wife who is not divorced cannot make that demand. Rather, the husband is obliged to spend on her as a wife anyway. And we said the exception to this would be if she's a nashiz, then the husband does have to spend on her on account that she's a breastfeeder. So notice the rule is different depending on whether she is still a wife or whether she is divorced, and whether she is a nashiz or not a nashiz. We take from this ayah that it is permissible to stop the breastfeeding before the 2 years, but this needs to be after consultation and mutual consent. These are conditions. No one is to take the matter into their own hands. It is impermissible. We take the permissibility of a wet nurse, and that the wet nurse has the right to charge for her breastfeeding services. We also take from this ayah the obligation of taqwa of Allah Jalla wa Ala, and that Allah sees everything we do, but of course not just sees everything we do, but will take us to account. This is the whole point. So this name Basir then would form as a threat to us if we step out of line. But if we obey, then Allah also sees this and will reward us accordingly. Wallahu a'lam.